If you walked through the silent corridors of the Alhambra at dawn, you'd barely hear the whisper of what once took place. The marble tiles echo now only with the footsteps of tourists, cameras clicking, shoes squeaking. But once, this palace watched as an empire turned in on itself. And at the center of it all was something far darker than a throne, something called the Inquisition. The story doesn't begin with torture chambers or trials. It begins with fear. Fear that came not from enemies abroad, but from neighbors, from friends, from family. Spain in the late 15th century was a kingdom in transition. The Moors had just been pushed out of Granada after centuries of rule. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were determined to make Spain not just politically united, but religiously pure. To cleanse the land, they said, as if people were stains on a cloth. The idea was simple. If Spain was to be one kingdom under one faith, there could be no room for doubt, no tolerance for private beliefs or hidden rituals. So they created a machine, not of iron and gears, but of priests, parchment, and paranoia. They called it the Inquisition. But this wasn't the first time Europe had tried to root out heresy. No, Inquisitions had existed before. But Spain's was different, more organized, more ruthless, and sanctioned directly by the crown. It didn't begin with fire. It began with paperwork, letters sent to towns, whispers in churches, edicts read aloud in public squares. Jews who had converted to Christianity, conversos, were now under suspicion. Not for what they did, but for what they might still believe. People began watching each other, listening for the wrong prayers said behind closed doors, noticing who lit candles on the wrong nights, who didn't eat pork, who wore clean clothes on a Saturday. Things that never mattered before suddenly became deadly. Soon the prisons began to fill, not with criminals, but with scholars, merchants, mothers, children. Anyone accused of backsliding into Judaism or Islam, or of criticizing the church, or of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. They were taken to dark rooms below convents and castles, rooms where silence pressed against the walls like wet linen, where windows were few and candles burned low, where men in robes asked questions that had no right answers. And when they didn't like what they heard, they used methods to make people talk. Not in anger, not with passion, but with cold, clerical efficiency. Because this was God's work, they said, cleansing the soul through confession, even if it meant breaking the body. And what about those who watched, who lived just outside the fortress walls or near the cathedral towers? Many turned away. Others peered through shutters and whispered prayers it wouldn't be their turn next. Because once the machine started, it didn't stop. It needed fuel, names, testimonies, accusations. It became dangerous not just to be different, but to be silent, to say nothing when asked, to hesitate, to defend a neighbor, to show mercy. These weren't virtues in inquisitorial Spain. They were liabilities. And all the while the church and the crown smiled. They said the Inquisition wasn't about punishment. It was about saving souls, about guiding the wayward back to truth. But the truth, as it turns out, was locked in those basements, screamed into the cracks of old stone, hidden in the scrolls marked with names that had been crossed out in red. And this was just the beginning. They didn't need evidence, only suspicion. A neighbor's glance, a servant's complaint, a word taken out of context. That was enough. The Inquisition thrived on doubt. It grew like mold in the cracks of trust, feeding on fear until no one felt safe, not even in their own homes. The accused rarely knew who accused them. That was part of the design. Anonymous testimony stripped them of the chance to defend themselves. You could be dragged from your bed in the dead of night, not knowing what you'd done or who had whispered your name. And once you entered the walls of the Inquisition's tribunal, the world outside faded like a dream. There were no lawyers, no appeals, only confess or endure. Interrogations didn't always begin with torture. At first they asked kindly, offered mercy, promised forgiveness. But mercy had conditions. Forgiveness required blood, and when kind words failed, the ropes and racks were waiting. They called it the question. That was their term for torture, as if pain were just another form of inquiry, a method of truth-telling. You were stretched, starved, suspended, stripped. Your body became a map of agony, and every mark told a story they wanted to hear. The worst part wasn't always the pain. It was the waiting, the hours in pitch darkness between sessions, the prayers you whispered to a God who might have been watching, or might have been deaf. The moment when you began to wonder if maybe you were guilty after all. Maybe you had thought something wrong. Maybe that candle you lit, or that meal you skipped, or that book you read, it meant something. They convinced people to betray their own memories. And outside, the world kept turning. Markets opened. Bells rang. Life continued, as it always does, just slightly quieter, as if the towns had agreed not to speak too loudly in case the Inquisition heard them. And they didn't just target Jews or Muslims. Nyon could fall under suspicion. A priest who questioned doctrine, a widow who read too much, a doctor who used ancient remedies. The net widened every year. The rules changed with every confession. You never knew what was forbidden until someone was punished for it. Confession wasn't always enough. Once you admitted guilt, the Inquisition might ask for names. Who taught you? Who else believed? If you refused, they called it stubbornness. If you lied, they said the devil was speaking through you. And if you told the truth, if you named others, you lived with that forever, assuming you lived at all. Then came the public ritual, the auto da fe. A ceremony meant to display justice, but it looked more like theater. The accused, dressed in yellow robes marked with red crosses, were paraded through the streets. Spectators came from nearby towns to watch. Some believed it was holy. Others came for the spectacle. It felt like a festival, if festivals ended in flames. And the church always said the same thing. They did not kill. They handed the condemned over to secular authorities. It was the law, not the church, that lit the fires. But everyone knew who stacked the wood. Those who survived lived with silence. They didn't speak of what happened. They didn't write it down. But you could see it in their eyes, a kind of haunted stillness, as if a piece of them had been left in that dark room, wrapped in chains, still waiting to be heard. And still, the Inquisition grew bolder, stronger, more organized. It was no longer just an institution. It was an idea, a shadow stretching across generations. Because once fear becomes law, no one is truly safe. Spain wasn't just burning books. It was burning people who read them. The Inquisition understood something that most rulers only realized too late. Power isn't just about armies or gold. It's about belief. Control the story, and you control the people. So they hunted not just heretics, but knowledge itself. They banned books, thousands of them. Philosophical texts, medical treatises, ancient poetry, anything written in Hebrew or Arabic, anything that questioned, anything that thought too deeply. Libraries were emptied, and fire became the final editor. But flames couldn't catch every word. And in the shadows of universities, in the back rooms of apothecaries, in the quiet halls of old synagogues and mosques, ideas smoldered. Hidden in coded manuscripts, passed between trembling hands, read aloud in candlelight. Forbidden knowledge, kept alive by those who refused to forget. The Inquisitors hated what they could not explain. Superstition walked hand in hand with theology. A woman who healed with herbs became a witch. A man who charted stars became a blasphemer. Even illness had no safe explanation. If your neighbor got sick and you were near them, well, the devil had a vessel, didn't he? It wasn't madness. It was design. A machine made to crush resistance, yes, but also to erase memory. The past had to be rewritten in service of the future, and those who remembered too much were dangerous. There were stories that whispered through taverns and fields, stories of families that vanished overnight, of priests who drank too much and confessed the wrong things, of inquisitors themselves who disappeared, their robes found folded neatly beside a stream. Even monsters have shadows, and not every horror wore a cross. But most stayed silent, because in this world, silence wasn't just protection, it was survival. And yet, some spoke. There were voices, rare and trembling, that dared to question what was happening. A monk who copied banned texts in secret. A merchant who refused to turn in his friend. A woman who stood in the plaza and shouted that Christ would never have wanted this. They didn't last long, but their words lived on, passed down like relics. Not in books, not in letters, but in memory. In lullabies and whispered prayers. In the look between two people who knew, without saying, that they were both still unbroken. The Inquisition began to export itself. Other nations saw what Spain had built and took notes. Portugal, Italy. Even the colonies in the New World would soon feel its breath. And with every new tribunal, the line between religion and rule blurred further. It was no longer about belief. It was about obedience. Not just to God, but to those who claimed to speak for him. And still, the fires burned. Sometimes you wonder, how could it go on for so long? Didn't people see? Didn't anyone try to stop it? But history is rarely that simple. When you're inside the storm, you don't always feel the shape of it. You're just trying to stay upright, trying to keep your family safe, your head low, your name off the list. And maybe that's the cruelest part. The Inquisition didn't need everyone to believe in it. It only needed them to be afraid of it. There were places even maps forgot. Hidden valleys, crumbling monasteries, dusty villages far from royal roads. Places where the Inquisition's shadow arrived late, but arrived nonetheless. And when it did, it came not as a scream, but as a knock on the door. A knock was worse than a shout. Shouts you could run from. A knock was polite, calm. A man in black robes asking questions he already knew the answers to. No anger in his voice, just curiosity. That was how it always began. Sometimes the accused weren't dragged away. Sometimes they were told to stay put, to remain in their homes, watched by neighbors, waiting for their day before the tribunal. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and that waiting, that was its own form of punishment. You didn't sleep. You didn't eat. You stared at the door, afraid of both silence and sound. They called it penitence, a time to reflect, but it felt more like slow drowning. And in the cities, things only grew worse. The Inquisition had built its own infrastructure, records, witness networks, secret cells in churches and castles. It was no longer just a tool of the church. It was a separate kingdom. A kingdom without borders. Its territory was fear. People began to decorate their fear in rituals. Parents taught their children to avoid certain songs, certain gestures, even certain ways of walking. Women burned old family cookbooks that used Jewish recipes. Men stopped reading the old texts in Arabic, even if that was the language they had loved first. It wasn't just that belief was dangerous. It was that memory itself could get you killed. And yet the records still filled. Pages and pages of testimonies, names, ages, occupations, what they said, what they wore, who they knew. Spain had turned itself into a library of suspicion. And inside that library were tragedies too small for history books. A child who named his mother, not you, understanding the stakes. A farmer who spoke the truth and watched his brother vanish. A midwife who knew too much about herbs and helped too many women. They weren't famous. They didn't start revolutions, but they were caught in the gears just the same. And those gears turned slowly, but without mercy. Not everyone was tortured. That's the part people often forget. Many simply disappeared into paper. Their names recorded, their fates sealed in ink, their stories ending with a single word: condemned. And once you were condemned, your body didn't belong to you anymore, even in death. If you died before your sentence, your bones were dug up and burned. If you fled, your image was tried in your absence, effigies dressed in your clothes, paraded and set aflame in the town square. A ghost trial for a body they couldn't catch. It didn't matter if you were innocent. The Inquisition didn't measure truth the way we do. It measured obedience, conformity, silence. And yet, some found ways to resist. A woman who smuggled letters sewn into the hems of her dress. A monk who forged tribunal documents to set the innocent free. A boy who memorized every word of his father's forbidden book, then burned it, keeping the story alive in his mind. Tiny acts, quiet rebellions, the kind that don't make statues but echo longer than iron, because the Inquisition was powerful, but not immortal. And though it moved like a god, somewhere deep beneath the fear, the cracks had already begun. Sometimes it wasn't the screams that haunted people. It was the quiet after. After the bells stopped ringing. After the crowds went home from the auto da fe, their faces flushed from heat and spectacle. After the ash settled in the square, and all that remained of a life was a stain on the stone and the memory of someone who wasn't there anymore. The Inquisition didn't need to burn thousands to be effective. It only needed the rumor, the possibility, the thought that maybe, just maybe, you could be next. And that thought was stronger than any rope or flame. In royal courts, the Inquisition gained influence. Even kings hesitated to oppose it. The church whispered in one ear, while the tribunal tightened its grip in the other. Judges, priests, nobles, all fell in line. Because even the powerful knew the truth. No one was above suspicion. They said it was about heresy. But over time, that word began to mean anything. Political dissent, personal revenge, even unpaid debts. One accusation could settle a grudge, remove a rival, or silence a critic. People learned to speak with caution, to look behind them before asking questions, to write nothing they couldn't deny. This wasn't just a campaign of faith, it was the weaponization of silence, and it reached beyond Spain. Ships left its ports, not only with spices and silver, but with inquisitors. The New World would feel the breath of the tribunal in time. The Americas became a new stage for the same rituals, same robes, same fire. Indigenous people were judged not just by their own beliefs, but by their resistance. To convert was not enough. They had to erase themselves, their languages, their customs, their ancestors. Entire civilizations were tried, found guilty, and punished with erasure. And yet the flames did not destroy everything. Not all memories could be burned. In the margins of old letters, scholars began, leaving coded messages. In artwork, hidden symbols, tiny gestures of defiance. Some churches, beneath their gilded saints, carried symbols of older gods, carved by hands who knew how to hide in plain sight. And over time, questions began to surface again. Quiet ones. in salons, in monasteries, among travelers and thinkers and poets. They asked, who gets to speak for God? Who watches those who do? And how do we rebuild after so much has been taken? Because while the Inquisition had silenced countless voices, it had also made one thing clear. Truth cannot be controlled forever. It may be buried, it may be chained, but it does not die. And somewhere, beyond the fear, people began to dream of a different Spain. A place where ideas didn't need permission to exist. Where faith wasn't enforced through chains. Where no one had to look over their shoulder just to believe in something different. That dream was fragile. It flickered like a candle in wind. But it was there. Waiting. Some stories vanish. Others survive in fragments. A faded journal passed down through a family. A broken rosary buried beneath a kitchen floor. A name carved under a chapel pew, small and trembling. These were the pieces the Inquisition could never quite erase. Not completely. Because no matter how powerful the machine became, it could never fully control what people remembered in silence. By the 1600s, the Inquisition was no longer a sudden terror. It was a quiet, constant hum beneath everyday life. It was in the schools, the sermons, the streets. It had seeped into the bones of Spain, and people adapted, the way you do when a storm lasts for generations. Children grew up learning not just their prayers, but which questions not to ask. Husbands and wives sometimes refused to speak freely, even behind closed doors. And yet behind that silence was a kind of resistance all its own. The decision not to believe, not to forget, not to become like those who watched and whispered. And still, the machine turned. But cracks began to widen. Europe was changing. Ideas moved faster than ever, smuggled in books, hidden in paintings, spoken in hushed corners of universities. The Enlightenment was stirring, and with it came thinkers who believed that truth should not belong to the few. Spain, once the most powerful empire in the world, began to look inward, and not always proudly. The Inquisition tried to keep pace. It expanded its reach to new targets, scientists, philosophers, even playwrights. It banned works of Galileo. It monitored letters. It feared laughter just as much as heresy, because jokes, too, were dangerous. And yet, the more it tried to control, the more it revealed its own desperation. There were trials that backfired, public punishments that drew not fear, but pity. People began to whisper again, not in dread, but in doubt. Not, will I be next, but why are they still doing this? And some within the church itself began to question the tribunal's purpose. Not all clergy stood with it. Some wrote letters in secret. Some sheltered the accused. Some simply refused to participate. Because by now it was clear, the Inquisition had long ceased being about faith. It had become a ghost of itself, still feared, but no longer trusted. And still, it remained. Some hoped it would simply fade away, collapse under its own weight. But the Inquisition had lasted too long to vanish quietly. It had become part of Spain's identity, woven into its rituals, its laws, even its architecture. There were entire towns whose histories were inseparable from its trials, entire generations whose lineages had been broken by its verdicts. And yet, even in those places, you could find people planting things, not just seeds, but ideas, conversations, hope. Because history, even the darkest parts, doesn't just end. It's carried forward, in the people who refuse to forget, and in those brave enough to ask, what happens next? The Inquisition still held its office, still lit its candles, still sent out its messengers. But for the first time in centuries, people had begun to stop listening. There came a moment when the fire no longer frightened people. Not because it had grown gentler, but because it had become predictable. The spectacle of punishment had lost its sting. The yellow robes, the chants, the processions, they no longer inspired awe. They looked tired, rehearsed, a ritual that had forgotten why it began. By the 1700s, Spain was watching the world change around it. Revolutions whispered through other nations. Science bloomed like spring after a long frost. And the Inquisition, still clinging to its robes and ledgers, began to look less like divine justice and more like a relic. It tried to adapt. It softened its tone, shifted its targets. Less fire, more surveillance, less torture, more censorship. But it was too late. The shadow it had cast for centuries was now turning inward. People were no longer terrified. They were embarrassed. Philosophers in Paris laughed at the Spanish church's iron grip. Writers in London mocked the trials in essays and plays. Even within Spain, voices rose, quiet at first, then stronger. They didn't shout. They questioned. Why are we still doing this? What God needs this kind of fear? And in those questions, something remarkable happened. The silence began to break. A priest refused to deliver a condemnation. A mayor turned away the Inquisition's messenger. A bookseller kept banned texts behind a curtain and sold them anyway. Tiny acts, but they began to spread. There were still arrests, still accusations, but now they stirred unease, not obedience. The crowds at the public burnings began to thin. The applause sounded hollow, and for the first time in generations, people stopped looking over their shoulders. Even royalty grew restless. Charles III, who ruled in the late 1700s, saw the Inquisition as a burden, an outdated tool for a kingdom trying to enter the modern world. His ministers pushed for reform. There were whispers of abolishing the tribunal entirely, but old institutions don't crumble overnight. They fight back. And the Inquisition was nothing if not patient. It had weathered centuries of change. Monarchs rose and fell. Borders shifted. Empires came and went. Yet still, behind locked doors and quiet halls, its scribes worked. Its files grew. Its symbols lingered on church walls and in courtroom corners. Because fear has a way of surviving. It doesn't need fire to live, just the memory of it. And that memory was still strong. Even as Spain modernized, even as railways crossed the country and electricity flickered through its cities, the Inquisition remained like an old stone, too heavy to lift, too sacred to destroy. But something had changed. For the first time in centuries, Spain wasn't afraid of what the Inquisition could do. It was afraid of what it said about itself. By the time the end came, it didn't come with a crash. It came with a sigh. A slow unraveling. A gentle peeling away of robes and titles and rituals until all that was left was dust and memory. In 1834, a royal decree finally dissolved the Inquisition. After more than 3 centuries of trials, torture, and terror, the tribunal was no longer welcome in the world it had once ruled through fear. The offices were shuttered, the files locked away. The flames at last were extinguished, but the smoke still lingered. Because the real horror behind the Spanish Inquisition wasn't just what it did. It was what it taught people to become. It turned neighbors into informants, mothers into witnesses, children into betrayers. It wrapped faith in fear and called it righteousness. It used silence like a weapon and called it virtue. And when it ended, when the robes were folded and the crosses lowered, no one cheered. There were no grand celebrations, only a heavy, unsettled quiet. Because how do you celebrate the end of something that never should have existed? Spain moved on. It had to. New governments rose, civil wars came and went. The 20th century roared in with machines and revolutions. But deep beneath the cobblestone streets and cathedral shadows, The old bones remained. Archives full of testimonies, vaults of names written in trembling ink, stories that were never told aloud, because the people who lived them were taught never to speak. Some of those stories are still hidden. Some were destroyed. Some were never written down at all, but some survived. A grandmother's warning, a scar someone won't explain, a family name that changed spelling, changed language, changed meaning, just to stay safe. Even today, when you walk the narrow alleys of old Spanish cities, you might find a house with no windows facing the street, a door too thick for its frame, a stone wall that doesn't match the others, little clues that someone once was hiding something, or someone, because the real legacy of the Inquisition isn't just historical, it's psychological. It taught generations how to doubt each other, how to hide, how to survive by being invisible. And those lessons don't vanish with a signature on royal parchment. They echo. And yet, so does something else. The resistance. The small, quiet rebellions. The people who kept the old songs alive. Who smuggled truth inside fables and folded it into recipes and lullabies. Who refused to let the fire be the final word. Their voices, those quiet, defiant voices, are still with us. In every question asked, in every book once banned and now read freely, in every act of belief that doesn't ask permission. The Inquisition tried to control thought, but thought is a river. It finds new paths. It flows beneath walls. And eventually, it drowns even the darkest empires.